Let's continue with this part here where we have the actual light bulb in. You can see there's a bit of a bevel. But before we get to that, let's position this cylinder here. And I'm gonna position it so that there's a little bit of space left here where we see this edge. And then we're gonna put the difference on it. And what we can do now is go back here to this Boolean operator and let's scale that down a bit. We can then make a bevel on it. And now with this loop, let's push it here to the front. So that way we already have this bevel taken into account that we saw in the reference. Just gonna push it back a bit. And then let's select that face here at the bottom again. Sometimes it's a bit hard to select. And let's collapse it to the center like this here. So now we can apply that and simply delete the Boolean operator. And as so often, we have to do some connections now. So I'm gonna free up some space here by dissolving this edge. But before we do that, let's get out of the isolation mode so that we see it with our other elements. Now I'm gonna select these edges here and dissolve them. So that way we already have more space here. And let me just think about these edges here. Let's also dissolve that. And the same here for these, all the way over to here. And then what we can do is snap these points here. So now we just have to do that also on that side because we don't have the symmetry modifier anymore. But now we have this here ready to do some more connection work to make sure that we don't have any overlapping there. So whenever we get to the texturing, this part here where we have the light bulb will get some emissive information. And that emissive will make it look like it glows. So then of course we will also have a version where if the emissive is off, it looks like there's simply some glass. It's not actually gonna have transparency, even though technically we could also add like another layer in front of it that is real transparent, but I find that is a bit of an overkill. We're gonna have this kind of effect with glass on our scope. So where we have the lens, this is of course gonna need some glass with transparency. But here for this part, we're gonna just have some specular information where it looks like a very glossy glass that's sort of like built into this. And then if we have the emissive on, it's gonna look like it's really illuminating. So that just as like an explanation for how we do that later, once we get to the texturing. And meanwhile, let's continue to connect that here. So let's also connect these points. And then very important here at the bottom, let's connect these points like that here. Or else we would have a high risk of some overlapping geometry there. This one here, let's just do the simple trick here with a collapse, and then we're gonna push it over to the sides. And also we wanna connect that here. So as you can see, we pretty much built that flashlight without too much time. Same for actually the scope. And as you can see, we started really just with a cylinder here for it. And that's usually how we should be approaching 3D. Start simple and then just add to it until we get to something like this here. So now I want to add a cylinder here. Speaking of cylinders, let's put that to 24 sides and radius of 3 and a depth of 5. Maybe we can still change that, but let's rotate it on the y-axis. And let's add that here once we get out of the snapping. as this button. So for that, I think 24 sides are more than enough. Let's scale it a bit down. And then, as we used to do already before, we want to connect it here like that. And then select this loop and let's give that a bevel, so that all we have left is push it over here to the right side. And that basically already gives us this shape. So now let's also drag these vertex points further here to the left. And then we want to just connect it. And also let's do that on the other side. So that takes care of that button here. Let me just get back here to that view and let's drag that a bit further in so that this is actually intersecting. And now let's add a bevel modifier. Let's change the offset and let's make it a bit wider, 0.2. And something looks wrong here. Let's disable the loop slide. Now it looks like a continuous shape without any issues. And then let's add our subdivision. Gonna increase that. And let me just go back here to this element once more. And under our bevel settings, it doesn't really seem to change much when we do the loop slide, but let's go into the wireframe view and let's bring the segments down. So if we put it to 2, it's not that sharp looking, has a bit more of a bevel with a subdivision. But I also want to add these vertex point connections here. And it seems that these connections kind of make that edge flow kind of strange. So once we put the loop slide off, it starts looking okay again. So this is what that loop slide does. And then let's see with our subdivision. And I'm thinking this looks better now. And somehow I'm still not happy here with this one. Let me go back here and let's also put the segments down to 1. And on that one here also. So that way it just looks a bit more smooth around these edges and not so sharp. And here on that element, just as a last thing, I want to add a subdivision here through the center. I think that makes the overall flow a bit better there. Hey guys, so we came to the point in the tutorial where we did most of the modeling work as far as our basic pieces are concerned. So some of them already have some high poly modifiers on top of it, such as for example these buttons that we're looking at here. But everything else still needs the high poly process, which we're about to get to. And what that means for us is that we have to think about the naming convention now. So we're gonna call everything that we have so far _high and come up with different names for whatever we want to call it at the beginning of it, like flashlight _high, scope piece _high. So this is the important step that is now about to follow. And then whenever we have this done, we're simply gonna copy these folders and simply rename everything from _high to _low. So that way we make sure that everything has the proper naming convention and every piece is the same, just in low poly and in high poly folders. So now it's time to think about how to connect these pieces here. And we also want to give it the proper names. So this one here is the flashlight high. That's the main piece. And now we gotta select everything that belongs to it. That includes these floating elements. And these floating elements, we can leave the name as it is. And then with Shift, we drag it into that flashlight _high. So now we have this connected. And let's just take a look what we have left here. So here we have this button, and I'm gonna apply the transformation so that we can then use the mirror modifier on it. Let's put that over here. And also here on that, let's put the mirror modifier back on. So now what we can do is copy this here, flashlight underscore high, just make a Control C and then Control V here on these buttons. And let's just call it flashlight underscore button underscore high. And this one here, we can also paste that back in and let's call it button 2. This is the other button. So most importantly, we need everything to be underscore high, and let's give it lowercase letters. And then once we get to the low poly, we call everything underscore low. So that way we make sure that this is baking correctly. And meanwhile, let's just go through these different elements and give them the proper names here. So this one, I'm just gonna call it back. Sometimes I'm not very creative with these names, but it doesn't have to. This is only for baking. So this one, let's call that flashlight circle. And that way we already gave names here to all our parts for this folder. And now let's do the same thing here for the scope. So it's time to make the proper names for everything. And while I'm on this here, let me select these edges and let's make that a bit more high poly by simply adding a bevel here to it. So then with our subdivision on top, this is high poly enough. And let's take that piece here for starters and let's call it glass underscore high. So this one here could be our scope underscore frame underscore high. And then we just got to go through it one by one. These here, let's call it scope underscore bold underscore high. And so on. And then later we're gonna simply copy these folders and exchange all the underscore highs for underscore lows. And that way we made sure that they have the exact same matching names, which is gonna be essential for our baking process. So you could call it anything really, like you could call it ice cream vanilla underscore high, as long as the other according piece also has the same name with underscore low. So this screw here, we only gonna need to name it once, scope underscore screw underscore high, because this is the only one where we're gonna bake from. The other pieces we still have to copy in place for our low poly. Once we did our unwrapping, we will take care of that. So let's continue this one here, scope underscore button high, and then these triangles here, we don't have to rename them. Let's just with shift drag that onto that scope underscore button high. And then this one here we can simply call alpha because there's no high or low poly for it. Let's just call it alpha. And now this piece here, the bolt, let's just with shift drag that also here under the according piece. And this one is the other triangle that we have here. We don't need to give it any name. We just drag it here into this stack. This is essential so that later for the bake, it gets recognized as a piece that belongs together. I'm actually gonna delete this piece here of the screw because like I said, we only need that once. And then for our low poly, we're gonna duplicate it. So now we gave names here to everything for our scope, all the pieces. Let's hide that as well. And let's just have another quick look here for our flashlight. And since that is all working and properly named, we now gonna do the same thing here for the revolver. Let me also hide the reference image so that we're only focusing here on these pieces, and let's unhide everything in that folder. So now, same as before, we have some floating details that we have to connect to the according pieces. But let's just get started here with this one. So this is crane underscore high. This here is we can actually just leave it as a cylinder underscore high. And let me just expand that so that we see it all. This one here, I'm gonna call it frame underscore high. And as you can see, we have a bit of work ahead, giving all these pieces the proper name. So here we had the hammer, and now this one here is the grip. And basically we just want to give everything names that match, even though it doesn't have to, because this is only for the baking process. So we could call it anything, like I was saying before. The most important is that it's underscore high at the end, and that the low poly has the exact same name, just with underscore low. So meanwhile, I'm gonna go ahead here, and we just want to give all these big pieces the proper names first. And then whatever is left over is gonna be the pieces that are our floating geometry details that we can simply attach to these pieces. So this is the important step to consider here for Blender in order to do the baking right, because in 3D Max we could give things the same name even. Like you could have a barrel underscore high and you could have another barrel underscore high, but in Blender that doesn't work that way, at least so far. So that's why we have to attach all these floating details into that object by dragging it on there with Shift. So that just as a little side note. Meanwhile, I'm going ahead and still busy here giving that all the proper names. Extractor underscore high for that piece, and this here is obviously our trigger. I hope the tutorial didn't trigger you in any way so far with any issues along the way. So we're gonna continue here. This is the rear side underscore high, and this one here is the rear side piece underscore high. Sometimes I'm not very creative with these names, but it doesn't have to. Like I was saying, this is only for our bake. And now let's hide everything that we were already giving names to, which automatically is visible at the bottom. Or I guess that's wrong. We also had some here at the top. But that makes it a bit easier to see what we still have left. And we just want to make sure we're not forgetting anything. So here we have the frame piece underscore high. And then this piece here is our front side. Front side underscore high. And yet another piece that belongs to that front side. So I'm gonna give it also the proper name, and then not to forget this piece here. This will probably not be very visible unless someone holds that revolver right in your face. So now let's also hide these pieces, and let's see what we have left now. There's that piece here. Oh, actually that was already given a name, so we can hide that. But that piece here is the trigger piece underscore high. So I'm gonna hide that too. And now everything that we have left here is geometry that is these floating details. And I'm just letting you know, there are still some of these screws that later in the tutorial I'm finally making my mind up, and then I'm gonna delete them. So if you don't have these screws, because I basically already warned you ahead of time that these are optional to make, don't worry about it. Now with these elements that belong here to that frame, I'm gonna drag it on it with Shift, and then let's simply hide it so that we see what else is left. So here we have this crane. And these elements here, also with Shift, let's drag it on. I'm gonna hide that, and now we have something here on the barrel. These elements, same thing with Shift, and then let's also hide it. So now only a few more pieces left. Here we have the rear side. And I'm gonna select everything and attach it on it. And these screws here, the ones on top and this, again, in just a bit, I'm gonna finally delete that. I probably shouldn't even have mentioned it because it might have confused you more than it actually helps. So in retro perspective, I'm thinking maybe I should have just not mentioned it. But either way, I'm going ahead, I connect this here for now. Let's also hide that, and then here's one more of these screws which I'm going to put onto the release_high. So that is everything here as far as the revolver goes. Now what we want to do is make sure to unhide everything again. So in order to unhide that, we have to clap some of these elements back open here, like the frame, and just make sure that everything is unhidden again. So let's do that for everything, and then when we have this, we now have all our elements here properly named as far as the high poly is concerned. So what we want to do is also give the folder this name. Let's call that revolver_high. And now we right click it and say duplicate collection. And then we call that revolver_low. Let's hide the high poly folder so that we only have the low poly folder here. And as you can see, we have all these elements here now with _high 0.001 because we made a copy. So we open the batch rename, go to find and replace, and we want to find high 0.001 and replace it for low. So as you can see now, we basically already have everything taken care of. That's how simple that is. And now we just have to do the same thing here for the other remaining folders, such as our scope_high, which we also want to duplicate. And then let's call that low. And then the same thing as before. Let's go over to batch rename and find and replace. The alpha we can leave as it is. That's perfectly fine, the name we had there. And then we want to do the same thing here. Duplicate. Then let's call that here also _high. And this here _low. Let's hide the high poly folder. And then with these here, they are gonna turn into our low poly. So this is really convenient and makes it easy with the naming convention here. So now on our low poly folders, we have to do two things. First, let's delete these floating details. And secondly, we have to go through our modifiers and delete most of them aside from the mirror modifiers. So we want to delete all these high poly parts here, the modifiers. Same here, subdivision and bevel, but we're gonna leave the mirror modifier on because we want to keep that mirrored. So the same here, let's go and delete anything aside from these mirrors, and then here also the bevel and the subdivision. So then we can hide the flashlight, and let's carry on with our scope low. Let's enable everything here. And then let's do the same as before. Let's delete these floating details, these arrows, and here we have this bolt. Let's delete that. And on that one, I'm gonna delete all the modifiers. This was just the bevel and the subdivision. And here, let's also delete it individually. That's why we have to go through it one by one, so that we don't accidentally delete the mirror modifiers basically. Here, I'm actually gonna collapse it, apply modifier on the subdivision. Wait, let me undo that. That caused a problem here. So I'm gonna undo it and apply the mirror modifier first and then the subdivision. So let's keep that already as one piece. Now let's carry on and hide the scope and unhide the revolver low. So here we have also some pieces such as this here. Let's delete that. This is floating detail geometry, and that has no relevance for our low poly, so we have to get rid of it. This is only for baking. Here we have these pieces on our frame, and we just want to be careful with that so that we don't accidentally delete anything that we don't want to have. So let's just take care of all these details here, which are these floating details, and then whenever we have them deleted, we have to go through the modifiers. So here is our grip now, and let's check here the subdivision. We want to delete it, and we're gonna also delete this bevel here and only keep the mirror modifier on. So actually the better way to approach this is go all the way here from top to bottom. There are some elements that don't even have modifiers, but here we have the cylinder low. Let's delete everything on that. And then let's carry on by going all the way through here. This piece, we want to confirm the solidify, not delete, but confirm. Let's carry on. So here we have the rail, and currently we have the mirror modifier on it. Let's go ahead and let's apply it already here on some parts. So here we have the rear side. Let's also collapse the mirror on it. And then here on our trigger, let's also do that. I just want to leave it on at some parts in case it helps us with the unwrapping, so that we can only unwrap one half, but in general we can already collapse it here for the most parts. So let's unhide all our high poly folders. It's time to work on our high poly. And what we should also do is press Ctrl A, and let's apply the all transforms, and I want to leave it all on aside from the location, so that we have our pivots still in place, but everything else, rotation and scale, we make sure we don't have any offset there. So the first piece is the cylinder, and fortunately we already have all our modifiers in place. We already did the high poly for it in the beginning of the tutorial. So in order to do that, if you remember, we were putting on the crease. Then we enable the remesh as well as the corrective smooth, and then we decimate it, and it just takes a good moment to load. So this is where I'm cheating a little bit, because I'm basically cutting out the parts where it otherwise loads like up to 5 minutes. Well, maybe not that long, but it does take its time, and I am cheating a little bit. By the way, I was also just upgrading to Blender 2.93. And let's just take a look at some of these little problematic areas that we have on the high poly. This is due to our decimate. So the decimate, you can try to increase the ratio to get rid of these details, these little issues there. Or you can also turn it off entirely. But then keep in mind, our face count right now is 425,000. And then if we toggle it off, we have to take it into the hide mode. It's a little bit strange that way. But now if we select it and we press Shift and H, and now we see this is 2,100,000 faces. So it's significant. So in general, these fragments don't really concern me too much, but if they really bother you, you can always try to toggle that off and see if you can still export later on. So it can sometimes just be a matter of whether these fragments appear in areas where it really bothers you, even if it's small, or if you can change it with a threshold. So it's a little bit of trying that out. In general, I left the decimate on for most pieces, and you can compare it with the renders that I have on ArtStation for the Revolver. There is really barely anything noticeable with these fragments. So I want to show you a tool that I just learned about, and it's called the Mesh Checker. You can get it here under this URL, and it's free. I'm gonna put the link into the essential file list for the plugins. And then whenever we have that downloaded, you can install it, and it will then simply show up here as MeshCheck BGL Edition. So then we're gonna select our objects where we want to check something, enable the mesh check here, and then we want to put it to non-manifold, which shows us any opened geometry. And that shows that here we have an issue, and we also have an issue here. Everything else that shows green is because of the mirror modifier and our floating objects, so these we can ignore. I'm gonna disable the mesh check. You might think, well, we're already done now, we're just gonna do the high poly, but there's still a few things that we have to fix, and then we're pretty much on the way to unwrapping and baking and texturing. So now let's get back to working on this problematic area, and you might want to check if you even have this problem. Maybe you don't have to fix it, but in my case, I'm gonna grow this selection, and then I deselect the faces at the bottom and delete what we have on top, because that was showing as problematic. And then I'm gonna individually delete these edges here. So it's a bit of a weird case. I don't know exactly why that happened, but now I'm gonna also delete the right side here of this circular element. And then I'm just gonna redo that connection. So let me just bridge it at the back and at the front, and then fill everything here in the center. Let me dissolve that edge so that we have a blank surface. And then I'm just gonna redo these connections here. So I'm still not 100% sure where this problem originated from, that this was having some strange artifacting here on that area. But thankfully someone created this awesome mesh check plugin. I think Blender should integrate that into Blender itself, because it's just so useful. And that way we were able to spot any problematic areas. So now with that selection, I'm gonna separate it. And then with a pivot in the center, we want then to apply a mirror modifier on that. So as we had it before, we have to put the threshold down. Let's put that to 0.1. And then let's collapse it, the mirror modifier. Now with that selection active, let's select the other piece which belongs to it here. And let's press Ctrl J. So that way we remain our naming convention, scope underscore frame underscore high, and then we just want to merge by distance to weld it together. So this time we have it fixed for real. We can then check here again, and you can see nothing shows up. So again, I don't know really what caused that, but that way we quickly were able to fix it. So the other issue was here, and I already warned you earlier, so you probably don't even have this issue. But since I somehow made a mistake there, I think it also had to do with the mirror modifier. I'm gonna simply select these faces here and delete it, and that already takes care of it. So as simple as that, as far as this fix is concerned. However, there are a few issues here that I want to fix on that mesh while we're at it. I'm gonna dissolve these edges and connect it like this here. And then I want to position that a little bit differently here. I'm gonna drag it over so that it meets exactly with this line. So in that case, we can kind of eyeball it. And then I want to do the same thing here on that side. Let's also connect that. And this vertex point, same as on the other side, let's bring it over here to this edge. So there are a few more things that I want to fix on it. The first would be to select these vertex points, and we want to align them with the vertex point that we have on the right side. So I'm going to go over here to our vertex slide, and let's just pull that down so that these are actually forming a straight line. And let's do the same thing here on that side. So that would be step one. And now I also want to connect this here like that, so that we tell Blender, look, this is where our triangulation is. And also I want to connect it like this here at these parts, and the same here on that side. So this is something I should have done before, but now we properly said this is the triangulation we want, and this is important. So now, just to avoid any confusion, let's hide the high poly folder and let's unhide the low poly folder, because what we have to do here is delete this piece, and then we go back to the revolver high folder. We make a copy of that piece that we were just editing, and then with this selection active, we right click it and we move it over here to our low poly folder. So now let me hide the high poly again, and here in our low poly folder, we will then simply rename it to _low. So that way we have these changes reflecting on our low poly. And now let's also work here on our high poly for this piece. So what I want to do before we apply the remesher, I want to grow this selection here, and then from the front view, let's scale it in a bit like this here. Otherwise, it's gonna get washed out by the remesher, which is a bit of a thing for like small details. Now next, let's select sharp edges, and that means it's now angle based. So we have to add a few more edges to this selection. So let's add these here. And then we go over and we say mean crease all the way up to 1 on these. Let's also take these two here and let's add that. And then individually we have a few more where we also want to apply that. So the same thing here on that side. We have to select the full circle, take everything into it. And also here we're missing some edges. Let's add that. And somehow it had problems here with the selection of these circles. So I'm gonna go to the left view, select everything with the edge mode and put it to 0. And then we simply gonna make loop selections here manually. to rule out any errors on that. So let's select it like this, and then let's put it all the way up to 1, so that we have these here also taken into our crease selection. And now let me just take another look around here. These elements, let's also increase them to 1, as well as these here that we were just adding earlier. And also here we want to have a sharp edge there, so let's add that. So there's one thing that I want to do, and it might look a little bit obscure, but this edge here, let's dissolve it. And also this edge here, let's dissolve that as well, and then let's connect it like this here. And now we just have to do the same thing here on that side. Let's connect and dissolve these edges. And this is because I think it's going to result in a better look for our high poly. So now with this active selection, let's select the cylinder, press Ctrl L, and then copy modifiers. So I'm going to basically cut the part out where this loads, but after it's done loading, it looks like this here. And now upon zooming in, we want to select also these edges here and increase this to 1 here on the mean crease. And then if we let that load, it takes a moment, it will reveal how this looks like now. And you can see now we have this sharp edge here, but there are still some issues. It looks a little bit imperfect. So what I want to do is select these edges on both sides. So let's collapse these selections on both sides. And then also I want to select these 2 edges here, or actually this one edge, and then on the other side as well. And let's put the mean crease to 0.5. This time not 1, but 0.5 to have a bit more of a smoother transition there. And while we're at it, you can see there's something going on here where we might want to also add the crease to this. So I'm going to also put it to 0.5. That way it's not so perfectly straight and cut off, but a bit more of a smooth transition. And then I'm going to let it load here. So this object is a little bit of a tricky one. The other ones are not going to be so complicated, but now this is looking much better. One thing I want to do is try with the increased smoothness to make it even more, how should I say, soft looking around the edges. I'm going to actually jump into Photoshop to show you, here's with 100 and here's with 150. So if I toggle that on and off, you can see the difference. If you look real close, it's barely visible, but I think we should leave it at 150 here for this piece so that our normal map will get the most out of it. So I know this is always taking a bit of time to load, but overall it's 100% worth it because it creates the perfect high poly model. And we don't have to deal with this whole pinching issues that usually the subdivision workflow comes with. So that basically makes up for it. And now let's carry on here with the next piece. And I'm going to work my way from the top to the bottom. So here we have the barrel cylinder high. And with that selection, let's go over here to select our sharp edges. And with these in place, all we have to do is add the mean crease to 1. And then we're going to select the other piece and press Ctrl L and copy the modifiers over. So in that case, I'm not going to cut that out because I just want to show you that I also don't have some miracle machine here. My computer is 5 years old. But this will always take a moment to load, and this is basically the only bottleneck of this remeasure workflow, I would say. But seriously, it's gonna save us so much time in the long run because the result is just excellent. as opposed to like the subdivision workflow where we also have loading times, but then we have to also deal with the whole pinching stuff on top of it. So now it's done loading, and let's take a look at it. And here we go. This is a nice looking detail. And we're also flexible with it. If you think that this is too soft looking, you can put the corrective smooth down again. So we're flexible that way. Now let's select this piece and let's carry on here. I'm working my way from the top to the bottom, like I was saying, in this Revolver High folder. Let's put the mean crease on it, and then we simply again copy the modifiers. And for smaller pieces, it doesn't take as long. So this one here, as you can see, it went really quickly. And now let's carry on with the next piece, which is the Barrel High, and this one we already have. So let's go over to the next one, which is the Crane. I'm just gonna put it into isolation so that we see where our sharp edges are after we selected it. And in that case, there's nothing else left to do. Let's just put the mean crease on. And then let's again copy it here from this barrel part. Control L and copy. And I'm not going to forward it because for these small pieces, it doesn't take very long. So in general, it doesn't really take much time to copy it from piece to piece. And that's something that I noticed, which is worth mentioning, because copying that is a crucial step in it. So copying it is actually the workflow that we want to choose, because otherwise not only would we have to always apply it from scratch for the modifier stack, but from my observation, it also takes longer to load as opposed to simply copying it over from piece to piece. So on that small piece, I was just putting the corrective smooth back down to 100 to make it less soft because it's already so small. So for smaller pieces, we might want to adjust the corrective smooth. And now let's see here for this piece. I just want to add these edges here into the selection so that we have a bit of a harder division there. And I just noticed that here I'm unfortunately making a little mistake. I should have added the other edges next to it. I guess that's a small imperfection that I didn't even notice that I have, but you know, it doesn't really make a big difference. So now I'm copying it from this small piece because we already put the corrective smooth down to 100 on it. And now let's see here. I'm thinking it's still a little bit too soft. I'm gonna put it to 75. So that way we have a bit more of a harder edges, and I'm thinking I'm gonna leave it like that. So here we have this piece, our frame, and there's one thing that I don't like here, which is this part, and we're gonna only fix it here on the high poly. We're gonna leave the low poly untouched, but now after we dissolve these edges, let's make a connection here for these edges only in the center, and then let's give it a bevel and let's make it 3 segments. Or actually, sorry, it's 4 segments. And now we're gonna dissolve these edges here and connect it over here to this part. So that way we have a way smoother transition there on the high poly. And for the low poly, it's perfectly okay to leave it as it was. So then once we have that, we can go back here to our sharp edges. And let's see what this comes up with once we put the mean crease on. For the most parts, it did the job, but there are a few things like this here where we want to edit. And then let's just take a look around here. These 2 edges on both sides, let's also add that. And just one more look. Let's zoom into this area here. There's like a few issues where I don't want to have these horizontal lines added to it. And other than that, it's looking pretty good to me. So let's select the crane piece here and then Ctrl L and copy modifiers. And then let's wait for the magic to unfold. I'm thinking this is probably my favorite part of the whole modeling process, to copy these modifiers over and then see the beauty of our high poly models. So this step here, I'm actually cutting out a bit. It took like 2 to 3 minutes to load. So once this is done loading, let's take it into isolation mode and let's have a look around whether we see anything that might still require some fixing. As in, like maybe we forgot some crease, but since I don't see anything, I'm gonna simply go over here to the next piece. Let's collapse the solidify modifier, which was still on that piece. And then I want to manually select the hard edges here at the borders. So that makes it just a little bit quicker in that case. So it's not angle based and we tell it like, look, this is where we want our hard edges to be. Let's also not forget the ones here in the corner. And then let's put the crease to 1. And then let's copy the modifiers from the crane. That should go really fast because it's a very small piece. Let's copy that. And this obviously looks wrong. So step 1, let's go over to corrective smooth and let's put that all the way down to 30. Or maybe even lower than that. Let's put it to 20. And now it shows that I forgot to add some of these edges here to the crease. So this we gotta increase. We gotta increase the crease and now it looks good. So that's also done and now we have that piece here. So this piece is a little bit special because we don't need the remeasure on it. We still gonna need the mean crease, but then all that we really need is the subdivision surface. So once we increase that, it's gonna take it from the creased edges. And then if we look at it here, it's all nice and round on the outside surface. And since all the edges are hidden, we don't need to remesh anything. So on that piece, we do have the edges. So let's select sharp edges. And then here for this selection, let's put the mean crease on. And then I'm going to copy it here from that piece. Copy modifiers, and this came out well. So let's carry on with the next piece, which is this really small one here. And in that case, it's so small that I think we should just do the regular sub D workflow. Let's add the mean bevel weight. And then we're gonna put on the bevel. Let's put that to weight. And then we have to adjust the offset here. And then with that, let's add our subdivision surface. So we can increase the resolution to 3, and that way we already have this piece here. So as you can see, we can always mix and match. For example, this piece here, the grip is also subdivision based, but for the most pieces, we want to use the remeasure. So here we have our hammer. Let's collapse the mirror modifier on that. And then let's go over to our select sharp edges. And let's take a look at how it selected it. Also here with the X-ray. And I do see some edges here that we want to deselect. Everything else looks fine. Actually, these edges here, let's also add them to our selection there. And then let's apply it here. Let's copy it here from this frame. Copy modifiers. And now it takes a moment to load. I'm actually not cutting out the individual pieces where, for the most parts at least. And here we have the perfect high poly. So we can carry on with the next piece. And this is going to be our rail. So here we have the mirror modifier on it. Let's collapse it. And just before we continue, I want to select all the vertex points and just make sure there's nothing left. And indeed there was. 4 vertex points got merged. So now that we made sure that everything is sort of waterproof, let's select the hard edges. And I want to deselect those ones here. Let's add our crease. And here on that side, I actually want to have a sharp edge here where this is going along. So in that case, I'm going to continue it here, that shape, as opposed to the other side where I want it to be one smooth transition. So just one more look. I'm going to go out of the isolation mode, and then we can copy it also here from our frame. Let's copy the modifiers, and yeah, that might take a moment to load, but don't worry, I'm sticking with you. I'm not cutting this part out. I was only cutting the parts out where, you know, it takes like 5 minutes to load, but there's not really that many pieces. It's all depending on the size. So here we have it, and I'm just gonna take a look around. Let's carry on. Actually, I gotta already put a spoiler on you. There's something that I spotted on the rail that we're gonna fix later, but I didn't notice it at the recording part so far. So since I'm voice narrating, I'm basically talking to you from the future, and I already know the issues that are gonna occur. But for now, we're carrying on here with that piece. Let's put the mean crease on, and this looks like it's working, so let's copy it over straight from the rail. Let's copy these modifiers, and now it's way too soft. So we're gonna go over to the corrective smooth. Let's put that down to 80, and it's still too soft. Let's have it at 50, and now it's better. Now we see this 6-sided inner part, which is what we want. Now here we have this tiny piece, and let's take a look at what we can do with that. It should be as simple as selecting sharp edges because it's a very hard surface looking piece. Let's put on the mean crease, and then let's copy it from this piece here right next to it. And that loaded very fast. Let's take it back into isolation, and you can see that we have some fragments on it. So you could just get rid of the decimate modifier on it, but what we can also do is try to change the corrective smooth number and see if that changes the way that these fragments are appearing. So putting it to 70 actually added more fragments. Let's see with 100. So putting it to 100, now I don't see any decimation, so it's worth playing around with these settings if you see these fragment parts. But what you can also do is, you know, simply get rid of the decimate because it's such a small piece, it barely makes a difference for our poly count.